Imagine, if you will, an evil corporation controlling the lives of hundreds of millions of people. A dystopian conglomerate that possesses a private army 3 times the size of the armed forces of its home country, lobbying and bribing politicians with impunity to further its endless world-eating hunger. No, we're not talking about Arasaka Corporation from Cyberpunk, or even the ExxonMobils or Samsungs of the modern-day real world. Instead, we're talking about a private corporation that was founded when wooden sailing ships still plied across the oceans. One of the world's first joint stock companies, which began as a band of pirates and scoundrels during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, and evolved before the time of Queen Victoria into an international megacorporation responsible for the ruination and impoverishment of the largest and richest continent in the world. Welcome to the first video in our series on the British East India Company. In this inaugural chapter, we will discuss the origins, foundation, and early rise to prominence of the profit-hungry behemoth which shaped the modern world and pioneered the capitalistic landscape we now live in.
You probably know already that you're still subject to some pillaging by individuals and corporations alike if you do anything online. But our sponsor today, NordVPN, is here to even the odds at nordvpn.com/kingsandgenerals. One of the many things NordVPN brings to your online life is a changeable IP and encryption of all data. That means when thieves or trackers swing by your social media profiles, search histories, apps, financial activity, and everything else, they'll find a confusing mess. But most importantly, when you're really under pressure with malware, phishing links, or even direct spying on your network, searching for juicy snippets like you inputting your bank details, for example, that's when NordVPN makes a massive difference. Their threat protection system will usually warn you and get you out of harm's way long before you're in their clutches. And if things go wrong and your info gets leaked on the dark web, they'll detect it, tell you it's happened, and how to get out of trouble. It sounds complicated, but really you just click on one thing on whatever device you're using, and it's all going to be taken care of for you in the background. NordVPN won't keep any logs of the data they handle, and you can even use their international servers to move data via other countries, ideal for overcoming content blocks or using a home connection while traveling. Try it out today with 4 months of extra coverage added for free to a 2-year plan when you sign up at nordvpn.com/kingsandgenerals. They offer a 30-day money-back guarantee, so there's no risk in giving it a go. That's nordvpn.com/kingsandgenerals.
Before we dive into the humble origins of the British East India Company, let us first take a broader look at its pernicious legacy of corporate violence. It is common knowledge that throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, the British conquered India and humiliated China. However, it was not the British government that did these things, but a dangerously unregulated private company, the most destructive megacorporation in human history. The British East India Company was not an extension of the British Army, the Royal Navy, or any branch of the civilian government. It was an independent, for-profit organisation which minted its own coins, passed its own laws, and prosecuted wars against foreign powers with a private army which was one of the largest militaries in the world. The East India Company was an empire within an empire, simultaneously entwined with Britain's imperial history, while also colonising vast swaths of Asia as its own private entity. Unlike India's previous conquerors, who had a stake in the governance of the land, the British East India Company's only purpose was to enrich its shareholders, which it did by siphoning the wealth of India and transferring it westward to enrich a handful of oligarchs living on a rainy island 7,500 kilometers away. It was no coincidence that Bengal, one of the most fertile regions in the world, suffered an apocalyptic famine, which claimed over 10 million lives under company rule. Beyond the Indian subcontinent, the self-styled Honourable Company was also responsible for being the harbinger of China's infamous century of humiliation, breaking down the closed doors of the Celestial Empire with a flood of addictive drugs whose sickly smoke flower embrace indiscriminately transformed everyone from the lowliest Zhuangzhou peasant to the highest Manchu noble into sunken-eyed, emaciated zombies wasting away in their beds. Historically, India and China were by far the richest and most culturally influential regions on Earth. Yet, in modern times, they are still fighting to catch up to the West in technology, wages, standard of living, and global cultural influence. This is the modern legacy of a single private company, which once ruled over an empire larger than most empires. With all that said, let us now move on to how it all began. Since antiquity, the continent of Asia was far richer than the continent of Europe. The civilizations of China, India, and the Malay Archipelago were luxury markets par excellence, with the peoples of Europe craving its products of silk, porcelain, and exotic spices, which moved westwards through the continental and maritime Silk Roads. Despite this, Western Europe had historically little direct contact with the East. Throughout the Middle Ages, Europe's primary spice hookup came through the middlemen in the Islamic Middle East. By the late 15th century, the most powerful of these Islamic states was the Ottoman Empire, which exploited its domination of the overland spice routes to its political and economic advantage. This state of affairs was economically unsustainable. But Europe was hooked. So, rather than kick the habit, they began looking for a new way to get their fix. In this, it was the small kingdom of Portugal that became the main trailblazer. In the year 1497, the Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama set out from the port of Lisbon with 4 ships and 170 men, embarking on one of the most seminal journeys in world history. Sailing an arduous and mind-boggling 24,000 miles by way of the treacherous Cape of Good Hope, they reached the Indian port of Calicut a year later. Da Gama's discovery of the sea route to India created a direct line between Europe and the maritime spice trade, and opened the way for an age of global imperialism. Within a decade, the Portuguese began rapidly expanding their colonial empire, establishing a network of coastal fortresses along the coasts of Africa, India, and the Malay Islands. Before long, the Portuguese were joined in Asia by their Iberian cousins, the Spanish, who began colonizing the islands of what are now the Philippines. By the end of the 1500s, the wealth generated by Spain and Portugal's overseas colonies had made them by far the wealthiest kingdoms in Christendom. During the 1500s, the Kingdom of England was a far cry from the global juggernaut it would later become. A poor nation with a meagre population of 4 million, it had no colonial holdings besides Wales and Ireland, and was a century removed from the Act of Union with Scotland, which would create the Kingdom of Great Britain. Ever since becoming a Protestant kingdom during the reign of Henry VIII, it had suffered deteriorating relations with the recently unified Catholic monarchies of Portugal and Spain. Consequently, the English sought to get in on the spice trade, and colonization hitherto monopolized by their Catholic rivals. During the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, English adventurers began roving out into the endless sapphire expanse in search of Spanish treasures. English privateers like Sir Francis Drake, Sir Walter Raleigh, and Sir James Lancaster were the most successful at this, sailing far across the world as they pillaged Spanish holdings in the New World and made contact with the rulers of the Spice Islands, returning to England with cargoes richly fraught with gold, silver, pearls, and precious spices. These journeys whet the English public's appetite for commercial expansion into the oceanic domains of their Spanish and Portuguese rivals, something which became more possible after England decimated the mighty Spanish Armada in 1588. However, the English monarchy was still a poor one, and did not have the treasury to regularly fund long-range expeditions across the open ocean. This was, after all, a pre-industrial era, where the vast majority of nations did not even have the finances to maintain formal standing armies. Sailing across the world in the 16th century was an astronomically expensive venture, requiring the construction of the largest and most costly ships of the time. Moreover, the risks of these expeditions were enormous and manifold, with perils like disease, hostile weather, hostile natives, and Spanish and Portuguese patrols contributing to a high fatality rate for its sailors. Thus, the English government bankrolled its colonial dreams using a method intimately familiar to those who live in our modern corporate landscape, by shunting the costs onto private corporations known as joint stock companies. The idea of the joint stock company was one of Tudor England's most groundbreaking economic innovations. Its origins lay in the craft guilds of medieval Europe, in which merchants or artisans from a specific profession could pool their resources to undertake ventures none could afford to make individually. Joint stock companies were a natural expansion of this idea, allowing anyone to invest in a venture without even being directly involved in it. The idea of being able to make money by simply buying shares and waiting for them to increase in value is not only normal in our modern day, but the cornerstone of the global economy. However, in the 16th century, it was a brand new innovation, one which titillated many among London's wealthy merchant classes. Consequently, various English trading companies accumulated enough capital to purchase ships and crews for long-range expeditions. These companies were provided with royal charters by the English crown, which granted them monopolies over English trade with certain regions of the world. It was during this era, when the rise of the joint stock company coincided with an English desire to tap into the luxury markets of the East, that a company known as the Governor and Company of Merchants of London Trading into the East Indies was formed. This name would later be truncated into the far less mouthy East India Company. On the New Year's Eve of 1600, the last day of the first year of the 17th century, the East India Company received its royal charter from the English crown and was given a monopoly over all English trade between the Cape of Good Hope and the Strait of Magellan. Its first governor was the prominent merchant Thomas Smythe, and its other founding members consisted of some of England's most infamous scallywags, such as the pirate Sir James Lancaster and the gentleman adventurer Sir Ralph Fitch. Together they assembled a fleet consisting of 4 ships. Commanded by Sir James Lancaster, the first voyage of the East India Company rounded the Cape of Good Hope and arrived in the Malay Archipelago in spring of 1602, forging trade deals with the Sultanates of Aceh and Bantam and seizing a Portuguese galleon in the region. More voyages soon followed, each of which provided cornucopious returns on investment for the company's shareholders. Initially, the company focused its commercial efforts on the Malay Archipelago, the islands which make up modern-day Malaysia and Indonesia, as they were where incredibly valuable spices such as nutmegs and cloves were produced. In a surprising plot twist, the Englishmen's main rivals in this region were not the Spanish or Portuguese in the area, but the Dutch. Back home, the Kingdom of England and the Dutch republics were Protestant allies against the Catholics. However, it was a different story in the Far East, where the Dutch East India Company, or VOC, was intent on establishing a full monopoly on the production of nutmeg, cloves and pepper, and were none too happy to see the English honing in on their market. Head-to-head, the English East India Company was the heavy underdog compared to its Dutch counterpart, possessing only 1/10 of the financial capital and less than half the ships, crew and firepower. The English set up in the region regardless, building trading posts on the islands of Ambon, Java and on the nutmeg-growing island of Run in 1603. Another island nation that the English East India Company probed into during its early years was the land of the rising sun. The first English vessel to arrive upon Japanese shores was captained by company employee John Saris, who crested upon the southern port of Hirado in January of 1613. There, they were surprised to encounter one of their own countrymen, the famed English samurai, William Adams, who had arrived in Japan on a Dutch vessel 13 years earlier, and since became a valued vassal to the shogun, Tokugawa Ieyasu. Adams was instrumental in facilitating an official meeting between Saris and the shogun. Incidentally, Saris's career with the company ended shortly after this trip, after he was discovered with a large collection of Japanese erotica. Although the English East India Company established a factory in Hirado, it was short-lived and unsuccessful, unable to compete commercially with their Dutch counterparts, who were better established in the region. After consistently failing to turn a profit, The English factory in Japan was abandoned in 1623. Meanwhile, tensions between the English and the Dutch in the Spice Islands were heating up. In the same year the English company left Japan, its factory on the Indonesian island of Ambon was seized by the VOC. By the second half of the 17th century, the Dutch had conquered most of Spain and Portugal's territories in the East Indies and turned their full focus on dislodging the English from the islands. In 1663, the Treaty of Breda saw the English crown compel the East India Company to relinquish their claim on Roon Island and its sweet, sweet nutmeg to the Dutch. England's consolation prize was a little-known island known as Manhattan, a place which would surely never amount to anything. Pushed out of the Malay Archipelago, the English East India Company had little choice but to leave the lucrative Spice Islands behind and focus on another market with equal potential: the ancient civilizations of India. Back in the summer of 1608, the galleon Hector made sight upon the port of Surat, the first English East India Company ship to arrive upon Indian shores. Here, the Englishman's main European competitors were the Portuguese, who had spent the last century developing a network of outposts along the Indian coast, the largest of which being Goa. When the Portuguese first forced their way into India, the land had been divided between many small sultanates and Hindu polities. However, by the time the English arrived, vast swaths of the northern subcontinent had been unified under a new superpower, the Mughal Empire. It cannot be understated what a global titan the Mughal Empire was. Ruling over 1/5 of the world population, it possessed an economy larger than all of Europe's combined and was rivaled only by Imperial China. At the beginning of the 17th century, the Mughal court in Delhi was a lion, the Portuguese viceroy in Goa was a bobcat, and the English traders who freshly arrived upon Indian shores were mice. So, in order to avoid being eaten by the bobcat, the mice sought the protection of the lion. To that end, 2 English missions were sent to the Mughal capital, one in 1608 and one in 1615. These missions were ultimately a success, resulting in the East India Company being given permission to build a trading outpost in Surat in 1618, the first significant English outpost in the Indian subcontinent. From this toehold, the East India Company purchased further territorial enclaves across the continent, buying the Tamil settlement of Madras from the declining South Indian Vijayanagara Empire in 1639. The East India Company's directors and diplomats assimilated themselves well into the complex politics of the Mughal court, outmaneuvering their European rivals to receive preferential treatment from its all-powerful emperor. As a result, the English commercial presence in India had soon overtaken the Portuguese. In 1661, the English East Company received the Portuguese outpost of Bombay as part of the dowry King Charles II obtained through his marriage to the Portuguese Princess Catherine of Braganza. Bombay quickly grew into the East India Company's largest commercial centre in India, with a booming colonial population of 60,000. As the East India Company expanded its commercial operations in India, it soon became ignominiously involved in the African slave trade, purchasing slaves from East Africa and transporting them to work in their factories in India. This was but the beginning of the exploitation and human misery that the company would become synonymous with in later centuries. By the end of the 1600s, the East India Company was by far the most influential private company in English society, with the cottons, silks, tea, coffee and indigo they imported taking their home country by storm, fundamentally reshaping English consumer culture and kicking off the English tea craze, which remains a core pillar of domestic English culture to this day. However, back in India, the East India Company was still very much a supplicant, fully dependent on the goodwill and patronage of the Mughal Emperor, to whom they paid obeisance and taxes to. The East India Company found this out the hard way in 1686, when Company Director Hosea Child declared war on the Mughal realm over a tax hike. the lion mauled the mouse with ease, batting away the English invasion force as easily as if it were swatting flies, and effortlessly seizing every English factory adjacent to Mughal territory. This humiliating defeat left the company's executives on their literal knees before Emperor Aurangzeb, submitting to Mughal authority and begging him for forgiveness. Feeling clement, Aurangzeb graciously forgave the Englishmen, returned their factories to them, and even allowed them to set up a new one at Calcutta in 1690. As dawn rose upon the 1700s, so too did it on the 100-year anniversary of the East India Company. Over the course of a century, the company, founded by a band of pirate adventurers a century earlier, evolved into an extremely successful international enterprise. Although its ventures in Indonesia and Japan had not panned out, its footholds in India were generating fabulous wealth for its shareholders, and it was from these footholds that the company's saga would evolve from a success story to a tale of rapacious infamy. In 1707, the Mughal Empire shattered. The reign of Emperor Aurangzeb had seen the Mughal Empire reach its territorial zenith, but left its vast armies diminished and its treasury depleted. After his death, hereditary vassals across the empire took advantage of the central government's weakness and severed their ties to the imperial capital of Delhi, resulting in the political fragmentation of the subcontinent. Suddenly, the East India Company was no longer a mouse under the protection of the lion. The lion was old and wounded, and the English were now one of many hyenas circling around its dying body. The playing field had been leveled, and now the East India Company was poised to play the turbulent game of thrones, which would see them become the masters of Hindustan. In our next video on the history of the British East India Company, we will retell the sequence of events which led to the company's complete conquest of the Indian subcontinent. To ensure you don't miss that, make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see those videos. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting, and sharing. It helps immensely. Recently, we have started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member exclusive content. Consider joining their ranks via the link in the description or button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.